Hi, today I will be doing a presentation on Islamic banking in the United States. Over the past decade, the Islamic finance sector internationally has grown steadily and rapidly, drawing attention from multinational banks and moving into European markets. Although Islamic finance accounts for just 1% of the global finance market, since 2000, Islamic banks have become a force to be reckoned with. Islamic banks' capital grew from 200 billion in 2000 to close to 3 trillion in 2016. This figure is expected to go up to 4 trillion by 2020s. There are now more than 300 banks and 250 mutual funds around the world complying with Islamic principles, with a yearly value estimated at about 500 billion. Over the past 10 years, the industry has grown at a pace of 10 to 15% per year. Islamic banking has been much slower to develop in the United States due in large part to rigid regulatory standards and a lack of legislative accommodations made specifically for the industry. Still, a number of banks and finance companies have dedicated themselves to the legal struggle of developing products and contracts that will comply both with religious law and with U.S. regulations designed with interest-based banking in mind. So what are the origins of Islamic banking? Well, Islamic finance, it may be rooted in ancient text, but as an industry, it is relatively young. The broader field of Islamic economics originated in 1930s India, when the country's Muslim population, then about 1/5 of its total, feared marginalization by British colonialism and the Hindu-led movement for Indian independence. Heavily indebted Muslim farmers throughout the country were at risk of losing their land. Scholars blamed an abandonment of Islamic principles and called for a return to true Islam. Economist Timur Kuran of Duke University, author of several books and articles on Islamic economics, has said that this revival was part of a broader movement to restore Muslims to their faith, carve out an identity for Muslim minorities, and generally protect Muslim interests. The first bank following Islamic law opened in Egypt in 1963, following the global oil boom. The industry developed in earnest in the Middle East in the mid-1970s. In the 1990s, the first international accounting standards were developed for Islamic finance, and the first market emerged for Islamic bonds. Islamic finance came to the United States in the 1980s when two institutions opened on the West Coast. Their investment and home finance services were available only regionally. The market broadened considerably in the late 1990s, paralleling the Muslim population growth in the United States, 50% in the 1990s and 2/3 in the 2000s. So the basic rules of Islamic banking. Islamic finance is rooted in the principle that investments should create social value and not merely wealth. The Quran, the 1,400-year-old text that governs followers of Islam, prohibits riba, the charging or receiving of monetary benefits from lending money, interpreted in modern terms as a prohibition against interest. Islamic finance also prohibits excessive risk or uncertainty, which is called gharar, gambling, maisir, and sinful activities, haram. So transactions generally must be tied to real, tangible assets. Usury, the illegal action or practice of lending money at unreasonably high rates of interest, and speculation, investment in stocks, property, or other ventures in the hopes of gain, but with the risk of loss, are prohibited. Transactions have to comply with Sharia, the legal code of Islam based on the Quran. It prohibits taking interest on loans. Funding any businesses involving products like alcohol, pork, or gambling are also prohibited. And Islamic banking is more risk-averse in its investment practices, typically avoiding businesses that could be associated with economic bubbles is part of their rules. Islamic lending is designed to protect borrowers who fall on hard times. Recourse, if a borrower is unable to pay, is rare, and firms generally cannot profit from a borrower's financial distress, since late fees in most cases can only cover the cost of collection. Most Islamic financial institutions have a supervisory board of Sharia scholars to review and approve the details of contracts. So how do they do business with all these regulations? Well, even with the restrictions, these institutions offer everything from mortgages and traditional loans to investment banking products, including Islamic bonds and equity funds. Alternative products are available in the United States for those who want to bank in a way that is agreeable with the Islamic religion. One of the first ones is, and just forgive me if I do not pronounce these correctly, I'm going to try. Murabaha, which is cost plus financing. Although used as a method of finance, a murabah is a sales contract typically used to facilitate short-term trade transactions. Rather than loaning the client money to purchase a good, the financial institution buys the good and sells it to the client at a marked up price. The client generally pays for the good in deferred payments or over a stated installment period. Unlike in traditional financing, if there is a default, the client is only liable to the financial institution for the contracted sale price and not any additional fees or interest. The financial institution must assume ownership of the good before transferring it to the client. The risk that the client might back out of the deal and force the financial institute to incur costs by finding another buyer justifies the profit that the institution makes from the marked up price. Ijara, lease financing. Ijara is similar to an installment leasing agreement and is typically used by financial institutions to provide funding for plant and machinery purchases. In this transaction, the financial institution purchases a specified asset and leases it to the client in return for rent payments. The duration of the lease and the rent for the entire term is fixed at the signing of the agreement, with the financial institution maintaining ownership of the assets. Musharaka. A musharaka literally means partnership. It's an agreement. It's typically a transaction where the financial institution provides a percentage of the capital needed to its client. The financial institution and the client proportionately share in both the profits and losses on the basis of a formula agreed upon before the transaction is complete. Because musharaka is essentially unsecured funding, it exposes a bank to a higher risk than it would face with murabah or ijara, where funding is secured by an asset. Diminishing musharaka, this is a form of partnership where one of the partners promises to gradually buy the equity share of the other partner until title to the equity is completely transferred to the buying partner. Mudaraba is a partnership agreement. It's a venture capital transaction, much like the musharaka, except that in the mudaraba, the financial institution provides all of the capital to a client, and the client provides only management efforts and expertise. Istisna, commissioned manufacturing. This structure is primarily used for assets which are constructed or manufactured. Salam, a salam contract is an agreement to purchase a specified type of commodity at a predetermined price to be delivered on a specified future date and in a specified quantity or quality. Sukuk, investment certificate or bond. The sukuk is one of the more innovative developments in the Islamic financial sector, and though distinguishable, the end result is much like that to a conventional bond. So a sukuk can be divided into two broad categories: asset-based sukuk, which offers fairly predictable returns to their holders based on the underlying asset, and equity-based sukuk, which offers less predictable returns due to the profit and loss sharing in the underlying investment. So what does it look like for Islamic banking going forward? Some U.S. financial institutions and lawmakers have expressed concern that Islamic banking transactions may deliver funds to terrorists. However, experts have testified in Congress that there is no evidence to prove that Islamic banks are more prone to facilitating transactions for money launderers and terrorists than any other banks. Islamic banks and investment firms are regulated by finance ministries and central banks that also oversee conventional banks in Muslim countries. The existing financial laws and regulations are viewed to be broad enough to accommodate the industry. Standards for the industry are mostly set by the Islamic Financial Services Board and the Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institutes. These two bodies include representatives from regulatory authorities. Different interpretations of the Sharia and regulatory practices across countries pose challenges to standardizing the industry. Islamic banking has been much slower to develop in the United States, due in large part to rigid regulatory standards and a lack of legislative accommodations made specifically for the industry. Still, a number of banks and finance companies have dedicated themselves to the legal struggle of developing products and contracts that will comply both with the religious law and with the U.S. regulations designed with interest-based banking in mind. So they're trying to basically establish a more just economic order in financial dealings, one that both provides greater security to individuals and also allows more productive use of society's capitals. I think at the heart of it, it's a really good concept that you're basically not trying to you're trying to help your fellow man when you're lending and not sort of prey on them. So I think definitely U.S. financing and banking, which kind of has the opposite strategy, could learn something from the Islamic bank system. Thank you very much.